Thank you, Dr. Hewson, and thank you, colleagues and guests. Good morning. On behalf of the Nous Group, it's been a great pleasure to be involved to date in the work underpinning the Future Economy Group thinking and report which you see in front of you. I should say there are two reports really to think about coming out of this morning. One is the report you have printed rather beautifully on your tables, which comes from the Future Economy Group itself, and we'll discuss that, I'm sure, at some length in the panel. The other is a slightly more number-heavy report by Nous, which will be available online at the end of this morning's session, and which I'll be largely speaking about here now. What I'll do is speak about I'll speak in five broad themes. I'll talk about the project itself. I'll talk about the three phases or three parts of the project that we went through. Firstly, an attempt to understand the present, to understand the situation in regard to Victoria's economy and its dependence on Victoria's environment. I'll talk about how we imagined what the future might look like and how we modelled what that future might look like. And then I'll talk briefly about the outputs of our work, although they're covered very nicely on pages 31 onwards in the report that sits in front of you. So a lot of what you might want to think about and talk to us about is covered there. Or to put it another way, if I drone on about numbers at too great a length at about 8 o'clock in the morning, you will probably all fall asleep, so we'll avoid that. I'll also draw some conclusions that came out of this work. I should say up front, though, that I enjoyed Dr. Hewson's commentary about economic modelling. Economic modelling is a fascinating area. It's not my first specialty. I was a policy analyst and a scientist before that. A lot of economic modelling, I find, tends to be a black box that you can't look inside, and the approach Nous took to this work was deliberately designed not to be that sort of approach. So the model that we built to look at the interaction between Victoria's economy and natural capital has been made available to the Future Economy Group, and I think will be made available on the website. We've even built a fairly attractive front end for the user so you can have a play with it yourselves and change some of the assumptions and see what comes out. So to us, that's a much more valuable tool for public policy making and for thinking about the future. So the purpose of this project was drawn for us from the stated purpose of the Future Economy Group itself, and that was, you can read this but I will read it, it's always worth focusing on these sort of details, to quantify the vulnerability of Victoria's economy to diminishing natural capital and to develop and advocate the policies and actions necessary to transition to a strong and sustainable economy which restores natural capital. Our role at Nous was to do the first part of this, to quantify the vulnerability of Victoria's economy to diminishing natural capital. We undertook that in the following way, as shown in this infographic. On the left-hand side, we started off by looking at Victoria's economy and Victoria's natural capital. To look at the economy, we largely relied on Australian Bureau of Statistics figures, the trends that were already locked into the economy, and I'll speak about those a little bit in a moment. To understand how Victoria's natural capital was tracking, we used the State of the Environment report. We were very lucky that the SOE report 2013 came out midway through the project. I used the term lucky in inverted commas because it meant we rewrote one entire section halfway through. We then made some assumptions and posited some hypotheses about what the nexus was between those two aspects. How did the economy rely on natural capital? And we built some numerical assessments of those into our model. And then we looked at 4 scenarios for how Victoria's future might track, and I'll talk a bit more about those in a moment. The model then crunched through those and produced some conclusions, which are what we've reported to the Future Economy Group and which underpin a lot of what they've written in the report that you see in front of you. First comment I'd make is that Victoria has a highly diverse and highly flexible economy. I must admit, when I worked in the Victorian government, and I'm a bit shamefaced as I've said to the TFEC group about this, we had a few mantras that we'd always roll out about the economy. That was that it was a manufacturing economy, it was based on the availability of cheap electricity. In fact, Victoria has a highly services-based economy, a highly flexible economy, a highly robust and diverse economy. It's been growing well for quite some time. It makes up about 22% of Australia's GDP and 25% of national economy. It's grown, as we say here, about the same pace as the national economy the last 20 years. It grew a bit slower than the mining states for a while, of course, and we've all seen some of the specific industry by industry challenges that the economy, as any economy, would face, but the overall picture, as I say, was diverse and flexible. Victoria's natural capital, and I use this term rather than Victoria's environment because I think that's important for having this sort of conversation. You can see, as well as I can, what we've put up on the screen there, but the report goes through a range of the challenges that we face in regard to fresh water, land and soil, forests and vegetation, our coastlines and ocean ecosystems, our biodiversity, the use of materials that underpin so much of the economy, and the impact of climate change on all of these. We noted that Victoria's economy relies very heavily on the state's natural capital. So this was the reasoning that we used to build some of the numerical underpinnings of the links between the two. Firstly, in some sectors, such as agriculture and fishing, the economic health of an industrial sector depends absolutely and directly on the health of the environment that it uses. So, as I say, agriculture and fishing, forestry are good examples of this. In some sectors, there are risks posed to the environment from the activities of that sector, which impact on other sectors. Mining and manufacturing are examples here, but there are many. Then there are more diffuse relationships between the environment and the economy, or between natural capital and the economy. In some sectors, as we've said here, the economic health of the sector is directly related to how much impact it has on the environment. That is, it benefits from being cleaner. And this is often a marketplace strength for those industries. And then, of course, there are some sectors that have minimal direct relationship with natural capital, but impact on and are impacted on by other sectors which are reliant on natural capital. So we tried to build consideration of all of these into our thinking. This lettuce and this diagram doesn't show up as well on the screen. It is in the report. I actually can't place it on page 27, although a couple of the titles unfortunately haven't come through particularly well in the printed version. This led us to think about, well, which sectors should we prioritise for our examination? To quickly describe what this infographic says, the size of the circles, the x-axis at the top is the different elements of natural capital that we've thought about, and the y-axis, if you will, down the side are the different economic sectors in Victoria as defined by the ABS. The circles, the size of them tells you what the reliance of that industry on that element of natural capital is, and the colour of the circles gives you an idea of how challenged or at risk that natural capital is. It was essentially a risk management diagram, and it led us to prioritise a number of sectors in our examination, and they're the ones that we've highlighted in grey. That table of the sectors that we prioritised is also included in the report. It's on page 26. And those sectors, it's worth just quickly noting, were in no particular order: financial and insurance services, healthcare and social assistance, agriculture, forestry and fishing, manufacturing, accommodation and food services, arts and recreation, which of course includes tourism, that's the ABS category, mining, and electricity, gas, water and waste services. So that's how we decided where to put the focus of our project. We looked at 4 macro scenarios, and I can talk more about these in Q&A if you want, but I won't go into too much detail of how Victoria's economy might go in the future. They are essentially on 2 axes for those of you who've done a lot of scenario planning. One was around how well the economy was tracking, one was around how well the environment was tracking, if I can simplify it to that point. One scenario we titled efficiency, where economic expansion achieved through some pretty tough, developed through some pretty tough decisions, particularly for some stakeholders, but the environmental footprint was considerably lower. One scenario we titled symbiosis, where highly cooperative efforts between community, government and industry lead to joint prioritisation of both economic development and environmental protection, or development of natural capital. One scenario we titled exploit, in which the economy thrived quite dramatically, but drawing very heavily down on our natural capital, which over time would reduce. And one we titled collapse, where the economy, while struggling, saw us drop away our protection of natural capital, our protection of the environment, and the two fell away at the same time. Our model, there's an equation there, which I always think is terrific to have an equation in a presentation. It basically took the data from ABS, from the State of the Environment report, the trends that were embedded in there, took the 4 scenarios and used these to generate a picture of how the future might look, or how the economy might look under each of the scenarios. Essentially, if you look at the orange line here, this is a schematic that shows essentially how the model worked. We had a baseline trend which came out of the ABS forecasts and figures and the State of the Environment report. The scenario itself would see each of the industries trend a little bit up or down. So scenario, for example, the exploit scenario would see growth in some of the arts and entertainment areas. We might have more Grand Prix and things like that, and so that would see that particular industry sector trend upwards. We would then apply a correction to that by looking at what the impact of growth or reduction in natural capital had on that industry under that scenario. So the orange line was the initial trend. The scenario would drive it up to the grey line, and then the impact of changes in natural capital might drag it down to the green line. In terms of the outputs, and these are included of course in the report that you see in front of you, as are quite a number of other tables comparing scenarios in different ways. We've tried to draw quite a lot of conclusions out of that. If you look at industry value add, the first 2 scenarios, which if you'll recall, we titled efficiency and symbiosis, trend well above the base case, under pretty much from year 1. There's a little bit of a drop in the efficiency scenario initially in terms of industry value add, i.e. contribution to gross state product. Under the exploit scenario, we start quite well but then drop away as the impact of loss of natural capital is felt by the economy more broadly. And under the collapse scenario, we took the name from Jared Diamond, apologies Jared, everything falls away quite quickly. In terms of jobs, on the right-hand side, the trends are quite similar. The key finding, of course, is protecting our natural capital offers us substantial economic opportunity. Whether the economy is tracking well or not, we will do better by protecting natural capital. Exploiting natural capital, on the other hand, poses Victoria substantial economic risks. If natural capital drops away too quickly, if we lose our fresh water, our forests, if we lose access to some of the materials we need, the economy will suffer from it. There are opportunities and risks which are quite significant for a range of critical sectors in Victoria, and these are covered in the report. I guess we saw this as very much a first pass over this sort of economic modelling of the impact economy-wide of changes to natural capital. So to us, the first recommendation was, second recommendation here, which I think is in some ways the most important one, is that we really need to do a lot more work in this space. We looked as hard as we could to see if anyone had done this sort of economy-wide study on the relationship between natural capital and economic performance. And while someone may now put their hand up and say, well, there was one, it was done in Ghana, and he said, that's fine, I'd love to hear that, but we couldn't find it. So we think this is a bit of a first. So well done to Kelly and to the Future Economy Group and to Mark for taking that forward. One of the things that became very clear to us through all of this was that a long-term collaborative and integrated approach to economic development and natural capital is needed. Now, the modelling we did suggested that the symbiosis approach, the one where all sectors of civil society, of government, of the economy work together to jointly advance both economic development and environmental protection will give the state the best economic outcome. Sector by sector, yes, there'll be challenges, but overall it certainly gave the best results under our model. Monitoring of the condition of natural capital to us remains a priority. We were very lucky, as I said, that the 2013 State of the Environment report came out midway through the work we were doing. It gave us the most up-to-date information on the condition of each of the areas of natural capital. It's crucial to have that sort of information. Economic monitoring is more central to what governments do. The ABS, I can't imagine stopping doing that, but monitoring natural capital that we think remains a priority. So colleagues, thank you very much. That's a very quick walk through what we've done. As I said, I didn't want to dive into numbers in massive detail. They're contained in the report in front of you. Thank you very much and enjoy the session.